So thank you all for joining us here for this second panel of the program. We're going to talk during this panel about artificial intelligence as providing a number of opportunities and also threats. We kind of primed the well a little bit with the threat conversation, but this panel is going to look at the issue from economic security, national security, privacy, and then innovation policy, which I think underlies a lot of this, because one of the things that came up during the first panel is that there are going to be countries and people that are really actively looking to go all in on artificial intelligence, and if they're going to control the landscape, they're going to have a great opportunity to succeed, and perhaps also, if it winds up being nefarious actors, opportunity to do a whole lot of harm. So if we want, my personal opinion is, if we want to make sure the U.S. stays at the front, we've got to have a much more robust and thoughtful innovation policy, which we will spend some time talking about as well. But let me introduce the panelists that we have here today. Let's begin by introducing Martin Racer. And Martin is the CRO and Managing Director of DataNet, an open source intelligence company. And in this role, he oversees and optimizes the company's revenue-generating activities and manages its North American operations. Thank you for being here, Martin. Next to Martin, we have Judge Michel. And Judge Michel is a former chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and he has become a good friend and great mentor to me, and we always appreciate you being here, Your Honor. Thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Kuhn, and Jen is an Assistant General Counsel for Product, Privacy, and IP at Tricentis, and she advises the teams on AI, innovation, privacy, and open source compliance. So let's begin the conversation. We can start with you, Jen, if you'd like to have the first thoughts here. As we begin this conversation today, what is it that you hope people have front of mind?
From my perspective, being a recovering IP attorney and spending most of my time in the privacy world now, I say the EU AI Act is giving us 3 years to kind of get a compliance program together for the AI systems that most companies will be deploying. Just little details, it's very likely to be published in April, very likely to go into law 20 days after that. So as with the GDPR, the act will be published, and companies and individuals will have several years to prepare their compliance programs. The details of that act, we will know more upon publication. There's a large trove of leaked documents, which I declined to read because it was 1,700 pages. But the one thing I want U.S. IP attorneys to take away is that the patent system in the U.S. does not really align in a lot of cases with how the EU envisions AI being deployed. For the most high-risk systems that they've identified, things like remote biometric identification, they're absolutely forbidden from being deployed in the EU. When you go down one more step in the risk scale that they've laid out, you come to things, and just by the way, one of the other most risky technologies that they do not want to see deployed is an AI-backed social kind of scoring system. So next, you'd go down to things like education, justice, applications, insurance claims, and credit reports. Those are all industries that in the US, we see companies deploying AI, laying people off, kind of not a great message for the employees in the same update call, but Wall Street kind of really likes it when you say, yeah, I'm laying off 600 employees and we're saving all those jobs with AI in a company that touches a lot of credit reports, touches a lot, makes those kind of automated credit-based determination. If you have that kind of system set up in the EU will require you to have meaningful human oversight. You'll see that essentially the human touch in the EU, in the NIST risk mitigation framework, in the OECD AI principles, in the the brand new AI ISO standards. And that's going to tell you that for the riskier systems, if you want to have a product that you can sell into 30 or so % of the world's purchasers, you're going to have a human involved. And normally, if you submit a patent application to the USPTO and you say, and this is the point where the AI system goes and checks with a human to see if the outcome is okay, that's not patentable usually. So that's my concern, is that the way 101 is, with the current state of 101, where you're more likely to get a patent if a camera's involved, a microphone's involved, or if there's no human involvement at all. I feel like the patent system and the way the EU system are going to be, the EU AI Act is going to be deployed. There's a real serious misalignment.
Okay, great. Well, let's stop there. We're going to come back to that, I'm sure, because that is fascinating. But Judge, let's get your preliminary thoughts here on the topic.
Well, I think the competition is between rule of law that's grounded in the political structure of a country and of regions and of the world on the one hand, versus free-for-all by whoever has the power, the information, the money to do whatever they decide is in their own best interest. And so the challenge is whether the rule of law system that connects to political structures can learn fast enough to be constructive in providing guideposts, limits, ways of assessing behavior, so that in the end that mostly controls versus the free-for-all that seems like the polar opposite. And that in turn will all depend on how fast people in this room and your peers elsewhere who have the knowledge legally, technologically, economically, and so forth, can teach policymakers and those who influence them well enough and fast enough to get ahead of this problem. It's basically a race, and it's not clear what the outcome of the race is going to be. The only thing that's clear to me is, left to their own devices, legislators and executive branch officials and others with public power are woefully unprepared to do what seems absolutely vital to be able to do. So can they be informed and prepared and guided well enough by people who do know so that they can make intelligent choices, or will it all just fall apart because of the lack of speed?
Yeah, and I want to come back to that for sure, because I think speed is a real problem in dealing with AI at the moment. But Martin, I'd like to get your preliminary thoughts before we dive into anything too deeply.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So I look at AI and technology more broadly very much from a geopolitical perspective. So I've spent the bulk of my career at the intersection of technology and national security. And in this current era of strategic competition between nation states, I see technology very much being front and center to that competition. If you consider how technology is a key enabler for military, economic, and political power, countries that get technology and technology policy right will have outsized influence over the trajectory of economic development, geopolitics more broadly. And a lot of what I'll be focusing on today is, just highlighting that particular aspect, because that's how a lot of policymakers in Washington are thinking about technology, AI especially, but also policymakers increasingly around the world are doing so. Beijing being a very important one, Tokyo, Brussels, London. So how policymakers think about technology, how they are jockeying for position when it comes to technology such as artificial intelligence has a lot of impact about how they view laws and regulations when it comes to those types of technologies. So that's what I'd like to bring to the table today.
And Gene, I left out judges, but how many judges sit in this room and learn the useful things that your panels provide? How many Federal Circuit judges have sat at these benches? How many Supreme Court justices have sat here? How many of their clerks have ever sat here through your program a year ago or this March? That worries me as much as the legislators, because these people in the judicial system who are inherently all non-specialists will make a lot of decisions, and they'll make them willy-nilly because that's their job. They have to decide cases. They will decide them. So then the question is, will they decide them in an informed, balanced, useful, logical way, or will it just be intellectual free-for-all, and whatever they dictate will be the law? So in every branch of our government and in the private sector, there's a problem of getting the people who set policy, public policy, private policy, getting educated well enough and fast enough so that we get ahead of the problem instead of the problem getting ahead of us.
Yeah, it's and that's going to be so critically important, I think, because, well, and to answer your question, I mean, you know the answer to how many judges have been to our programs, and we get a good number of retired judges, and we have had actually district court judges. We do get district court trial judges. I've given up inviting the Federal Circuit. You know, I tried to contact the clerk's office and said, look, we do all these programs. If any of your clerks want to come, if any of the judges want to come, any of your staff attorneys want to come, you have an open invitation. And I was told that that's not how it works. You have to invite each person specifically. And I'm like, okay. You know, it's hard to believe that we live in an era of AI, you know, and we have some people, like, clearly the room is pretty full here. We have people really interested in this topic. And then we have people that are really afraid of this topic. And then, shockingly to me still, we have people that couldn't care less. And that worries me. Martin, let me go to you when I say that, right? Because I would think as a national security expert, it would have to worry you too, right? That more policymakers aren't front and center and ready to be educated.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes for biotechnology, quantum information science, you name it. All the technologies that will fundamentally alter our society, that will drive economic growth, that will define geopolitics. All those technologies are by and large being developed in the private sector. And we are in a true competition with other countries as to who can create the next breakthrough first, because first mover advantage is hugely important in this. A lot of people, to your point, Gene, just don't care because I don't think understand what the consequences are, what's truly at stake. It's not just economic power relative to other countries, but it's also, you know, speaking as an American, all the values and ideals that we hold dear, because there is a negative impact on democratic societies as well, because a country like China, for example, is not just developing these technologies and exporting them, but they're also exporting the legal frameworks that go with the use of AI, for example, surveillance technologies, where Chinese firms are selling video cameras, all the software that you could use to analyze where people are going and when, predictive analytics to prevent protests and crime. But the Chinese perspective, or I should say the CCP perspective on this, is not in accordance with democratic values. So what does that then mean when other countries start adopting and adapting these same techniques that are being used inside China today? There's a lot of repression, and it's more than just countries trying to get the best of each other in a certain tech area. It also impacts everything that we do on a day-to-day basis, and election interference is just one recent example of of how that's impacting us directly.
And if I could follow up
Sure.
on Martin's point really quick, we have a recent example of an emerging area of technology that we had the ability to regulate, we had the ability to move faster, we declined to do it, and a lot of people lost a lot of money, and that was the cryptocurrency bubble. Bitcoin had been around for quite a while. Jurisdictions had passed a Virtual Asset Service Provider Act, but the US government declined most enforcement until a lot of people started losing a lot of money. The companies in the US that leaned into compliance, namely Coinbase and Gemini, are both still in business, and FTX and Binance are gone, and people are in jail. You know, the perp walk is very motivating in this area. People lost money, it was hard, but with AI, we may be looking at a scenario where the consequences are more than just, I lost my life savings and my kids and I don't have a place to live. Those were real consequences, but I feel like the consequences for AI could be significantly worse.
Yeah, and that's something, Judge, you brought up when you were talking about this speed. There seems to me to be a whole lot of companies racing to get out there. And, you know, just in the news over the week before this program is about, you know, disaster, various levels of disaster and PR problems, and with the AI saying things that are just egregiously wrong or horribly embarrassing. We told somebody essentially to commit suicide, go ahead. You know, I mean, but it seems like everybody just wants to get out there, be first, and they're afraid to be left behind and let others. And that, to me, doesn't strike me as a good solution.
Well, before I was emphasizing the lack of understanding by people in power, particularly policymakers, but there's an equally bad problem which I would describe as structural. And that is, in our system, in sharp contrast to many other systems in Europe and in certain leading Asian countries, including China, is that almost all of our advisors and deciders are generalists, including all the judges. In other countries, they have adopted a much more specialized approach. So, for example, in Germany, patent cases get tried by patent judges who are experts in this. And have been doing it their whole career. Here we have politically appointed judges who are all generalists. So we're at a big disadvantage compared to strategic and competitive rivals, not to mention in controlling the companies that are racing ahead, and you can't blame them if there are no rules and there are possible benefits. People are going to do what they see as beneficial, whether it's socially useful or even safe or not. So if we expect self-restraint from the private sector companies, I think that's illusory. So there has to be some restraint coming from some external source, which normally has been government officials, but they're so ill-equipped to even understand the problems or to get ahead of the problems or to keep up with the lightning speed developments of AI and other technologies too, but AI might be the most dramatic because it's lightning fast. And so it comes back to this problem of how do we help the people in power get smart fast enough to put some controls both for benefits and to avoid harms.
So Martin, let me ask you, you know, I mean, again, I struggle sometimes to figure out what it is that I want to ask in this area, because it is happening so fast. And I also want to resist the temptation of just treating AI as if it is a thing, you know, because there's multiple different AI models, and some are good, some are bad, some are good at some things, some are not so good at other things. And then different companies have different AI models and different levels of readiness, you might say. But one of the things that came out during the last panel and in the conversations we had between the panels is just how these AI models are trained and where the data comes from. And it was, I will say, shocking to me, because I had in my head that people would be feeding stuff into their models that they had reason to believe was credible and correct and knowledgeable and accurate. And it just seems like that's not the case. I mean, as a national security expert, I mean, how much should we be afraid of the way AI is being trained? And just this like, sure, just grab it, teach it, you know, because not all things ought to be taught.
Yeah, it's a big problem, right? And in a lot of cases, it's garbage in, garbage out. That's why we see very faulty models. I think the biggest issue that we have right now is that we don't have standards yet for things like veracity, for things like explainability. It is very difficult to audit any AI-enabled system right now to understand why a certain outcome was the result of your query or why a certain recommendation is being made. There are bright spots, however. The Department of Defense, for example, I think is very thorough and amongst any defense ministry equivalent around the world is doing some very sharp thinking on this. So I'm thinking specifically of somebody like General Jack Shanahan, who originally led Project Maven, and then the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. There was a lot of thinking going on inside the department of how the Department of Defense should use artificial intelligence, from the very kinetic type of activities such as targeting and actually having semi-autonomous weapon systems perform their specific mission, but all the way down to things like predictive maintenance, which the Navy is currently using, for example, to streamline their operations. So it is very much possible with the right guidance and the right stipulations to actually have AI-enabled systems that you can trust. DARPA is doing a lot of work in this. NIST is doing a lot of work in this. The problem, however, is that much of this development is taking place in the private sector where there are no real guardrails at all right now. And that's a huge disconnect. Other than some very tailored applications in artificial intelligence, it's still very much the Wild West because Washington hasn't had the political will to come up with any meaningful regulations on that front. That's a huge, huge problem overall.
Yeah, and Jen, I want to get your thoughts on this too, because as you were saying, what's going on in Europe, they want to have a person, and essentially like the buck stops where? Where does the buck stop? It's got to stop with a person who's got something in charge of, if there's mistakes made, rectifying the mistakes, making sure the mistakes don't happen, that sort of thing. Because what could possibly go wrong, right?
So every company offering an AI system in the EU will essentially have to assign a risk level to it and provide a compliance assessment. And actually, the chatbots are categorized as a lower risk, essentially like second from the bottom, as a lower risk AI tool. And when you go the next level up is use in education. So if you were talking about the two different kinds of education AI that we see right now, one being the apparently very faulty AI detector, where the teacher submits the paper, the student has apparently used ChatGPT, but essentially the failure rate is quite high because there's a lot of discussion. Anyone deploying that kind of system for educational purposes in the EU would essentially have to present the European Commission a kind of AI audit that showed that the system, the data used to train the system, the steps that the internal teams used to test whether or not the outcomes were accurate. And so you're going to get that EU kind of seal of approval with the compliance audit. And if you're representing your product as being properly audited and it turns out that it's not, you are going to be subject to 7%, essentially 7% of your global revenue. So global turnover is the key. So not having the right audit, not having an accurate audit will subject you to that action in the European Court of Justice, 7% of your global turnover, it is 50% higher, approximately, for the max fines that you could get for violating the GDPR. The fines are intended to be painful, but not unrecoverable. It's not for most big companies, it's not a company-ending event. If you have to turn over 7% of your last year's global revenue, not just EU revenue, global revenue. It's painful, it's designed to encourage compliance. Just in looking back at the GDPR, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google have all had major fines, like hundreds of millions of euros fined against them for failing to comply with the GDPR in various ways. And so we can anticipate that AI companies will spend the next 3 years preparing these audits and getting ready to sell into the EU, or the other alternative is to block access to the models. If you don't have, and this is one of the problems that I'm a little concerned about, only your larger players are going to be able to stand up an internal GRC team and prepare an audit. Perhaps some smaller companies will be able to hire an external team to come in and run an audit. But it is not going to be, you're not going to have small AI companies selling into the EU in any of the medium or high-risk categories.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that issue tomorrow when we have an antitrust panel, an expanded antitrust panel, because there is a lot of fear, and if you all, Martin or Judge, you want to talk about this, a lot of fear that because of, for a whole host of reasons, there's going to be a real consolidation in a certain number of companies that are going to run AI. Judge, it looks like you want to.
Well, I think it's inevitable that will be true, because when you have no limits, you basically have the law of the jungle. You're trusting on people to do the right, patriotic, decent thing, and lots of people will, but lots of people won't. So you're going to get bad actors with enormous power to do lots of harm, and the harm will happen unless they're somehow restrained by something other than their fellow behemoth corporate rival. And one of the problems we talk about, how do we verify that the information going into AI systems is accurate, or that the things coming out are accurate? There is a similar verification problem in public decision making, because all of the decision makers, and I've been doing this now for almost 14 years, since retiring in 2010, are besieged by narratives, about half of which are highly distorted or flat out false. And they have a terrible time sorting out what's accurate and reliable from what isn't accurate and reliable, because the science of public relations and lobbying and PR and spin has gotten so good that nonsense can sound extremely plausible and logical, and it can only be detected by somebody with a very sharp understanding of the whole landscape. And that's not our public sector. That's not the aides to the congressman. That's not the judges. It's not their law clerks. It's not people in the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So we have a huge problem, and talk about U.S. democratic values that need to be protected and hopefully adopted elsewhere, but at least protected here. We aren't gearing up to be able to do any of that. We aren't even trying. Forget about the comparison with European bureaucracy. I'm not sure they have all the answers either, because they are a big bureaucracy, and that has inherent problems in my book. But at least they're trying, and here nobody's trying, and we have a circumstance where the legal regimes just don't fit this at all. Copyright law doesn't fit this new technology well. Patent law doesn't fit this new technology well. Privacy law doesn't fit this technology well. We basically don't have any legal systems that are ready to cope with this. So we have to build them. But to build them, we have to make changes. And that means you have to get the legislators, particularly the Congress, but maybe even state and local legislators as well, to be able to sort out these problems, get expert advice from people like those in this room and their peers elsewhere, and get on top of the problem. Because right now, we're not on top of any of these problems, and we're falling behind our own need and all of our foreign commercial and strategic rivals more and more every day. So it's way past time to wake up and get on top of this.
Yeah. Martin, you want to react to what Judge said? I mean, because that truth just scares the bejesus out of me from a U.S. Security perspective, whether you're talking about economic security or national security, and I frankly think that they're really one and the same. I don't think you could have one without the other. But actually, well, I want to get Martin's thought on this, but I wanted to just say, like, it seems like what we're being told in the public debate is, like, I don't know that anybody's lying to us. It's just they only give us ever half of the story, and then when you hear the other half, it feels like you got lied to, But how does that work in a world where we're increasingly giving over to AI? I mean, how does that work from, like, for example, I'll put it in context, like the Defense Department, right? I mean, how can they rely on some of the stuff that's being developed by the private sector, not knowing where any of this came from, not knowing that any of the information was true or vetted on any level?
Yeah. Well, so in the specific case of the Department of Defense, they do have rigorous testing and evaluation of AI-enabled systems that they use. Now, room for improvement, certainly, but I'd say overall, what the Department of Defense has been doing so far has been quite rigorous. Mm-hmm. What concerns me is that type of test and evaluation methodology is not commonplace outside of certain pockets of excellence, I'll call them, in that regard. There's also not an alignment between the United States and its allies and strategic partners on what that type of test and evaluation should be, either for military context or in a broader commercial context, and that's why we're seeing these divergent approaches to AI-related regulation. To Jen's point, like, the Europeans are well ahead of the rest of the world on this. There's some other broader multinational efforts, but there are so many that they're essentially at cross purposes with each other. So that in and of itself is a problem. And frankly, up until recently, the United States hasn't been all that willing to even engage in those dialogues. And that's also a problem because the United States remains the world's largest economy, remains the world's technology leader, and if you have that actor not at the forefront of these discussions, then others take the ball and start running. It puts the U.S. at a disadvantage as well.
Go ahead, Jen.
I wanted to ask Martin and the judge about the one thing that I think the U.S. has done over the last few years, and that's the CHIPS Act. Mm-hmm. I think domestic production of the chips used to train the models is the key thing that we have done to protect ourselves. It was billed as an economic act, but it has tremendous national security implications that Martin can speak to.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well, yeah, the CHIPS Act. So that is a $52 billion bill to promote semiconductor fabrication, semiconductor packaging, also semiconductor design in the United States. I was very supportive of that effort, but we do have to look at it in context. 52 billion sounds like a lot on paper, but a new fabrication facility costs anywhere from $10 to $30 billion. So in that regards, it's a small down payment on what's needed. The company TSMC, that's a Taiwanese company, that's the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. Their capex for 2025 is projected to be about $300 billion. So that, in comparison, makes the CHIPS Act seem quite small. That said, it's a nice shot in the arm for U.S. industry, U.S. capabilities in the field. A lot of, beyond design, most of the U.S. capabilities were shipped overseas, mostly to East Asia. So the problem then is, in order to become more competitive in the field again, to introduce geographic diversity, supply chain resilience. Yes, that's a very good step in that direction. But Secretary Raimondo has already talked about the need for a CHIPS Act 2, which probably will happen. It will have to happen over time because the current investment, as I mentioned, it's a down payment. It has to be a continuous and dedicated effort to help sustain an industry, especially if you want to push against globalizing forces. That always goes for the lowest cost, most efficient method of manufacturing. It's often not in the United States. It's just more expensive here. That's the reality of it.
Yeah, you know, I laugh. Lowest cost, most efficient manufacturer. You know, you could have two of them. You could either be, what is it? How's the saying go? You're good and cheap and fast, right? You could have any two of the three. I think it is, right? Judge, you have thoughts on?
Well, I want to go back to public decision makers in all three branches in the United States to observe that they have a sort of an inertial paralysis problem. Our U.S. Congress, for example, is almost entirely dysfunctional because any side can block anything. It's so easy the way the process works now in the U.S. Congress to stop something. It's very hard to get something all the way through the numerous wickets to final passage and becoming law. And so when there are contending forces, as there usually are, there's a danger that a decision just never gets made. Consider the fact that despite the passage of the CHIPS Act, 3 years ago, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence issued its long, detailed report. Since then, its chairman wrote a very widely read book with Henry Kissinger, and they called on the public leaders to enact laws dealing with this problem. What's happened in the ensuing 3 years? Absolutely nothing. Congress has had a couple symbolic hearings to try to convey the idea that they're interested in the problem, they're looking into it, they're going to do something someday. But I think these are fig leaf gestures, not serious legislative forward-moving efforts. And part of that is because our system now it's so easy to block things. There are 100 ways you can stop legislation from moving forward, and they're all used all the time. If the status quo were fine and we didn't need new laws, that dysfunction would be helpful. But if we're in the opposite situation, as I think we are, where we need a whole lot of very creative, broad, strong legislation, the fact that it's so hard to get anything done is a curse, is a trap. And we got to find a way to get out of that trap in my book.
Yeah. So Jen, are we going to be living in a world where the Europeans are going to be in charge of regulating AI just because they're out there first, and companies are going to if they're going to require it, companies are going to have to deal with it. Europe is too large to forfeit that marketplace. So, and if that happens, I mean, how fast is it going to happen? And I mean, because they seem to be the ones that are. And I don't always agree with what they're doing. And like I think Judge said, they probably could do better, but at least they're doing something.
Well, it's an interesting question. When the antitrust panel will have more details than I have on the EU's antitrust actions. But when you look at the deals that the EU has killed, the Adobe Figma deal, and the Amazon and iRobot deal, not because of data issues, just because they identified a consumer harm. I was looking forward to the Amazon iRobot deal because I think that's the kind of the chocolate and peanut butter of the working attorney parent lifestyle. It was going to be a great thing for me personally, but I can understand when I read the EU Commission's report, I was like, well, you know, you don't not have a point there, and that stopped the deal. It's hard to say because we're seeing individual states take action on AI, just as we see individual states take action on privacy. That kind of scattershot, kind of patchwork approach in privacy makes compliance really, really hard in the US. And the EU, will essentially have one standard. Individual countries can set higher standards, but the EU AI Act is going to be the floor for any sales into the EU. And I mean, there's no, unless California moves fast, there's no state with kind of a similar market power to drive a US-based AI regulation. I'm hopeful, but I also don't think there's going to be a US general data protection law for a variety of reasons, partly because Congress does not seem to be willing to act on it, partly because I think the Supreme Court would have issues with the kinds of fines you'd need to have in order for it to be a meaningful deterrent to unlawful processing. So for various nerdy Supreme Court privacy reasons. So I mean, I think so. I think likely the EU is going to be driving the bus unless we can find out what we want out of these tools other than just money. I mean, we know a lot of people are investing in it. We know people want money. We know the government wants security. What else do we want out of them other than that?
Yeah. So do we have any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Oh, go ahead.
Hey, everyone. Thanks
Oh,
for
hey,
a great
Chris.
panel.
Hey, Chris.
Maybe just a couple observations and a thought. I work with Judge Michelle on a few things. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill and was just up with some folks last week talking a lot about this. And it feels like there's, and Martin, you kind of alluded to this tension, right? I think a lot of policymakers are starting to think things and make some conclusions about AI based on what they've heard, but they're not quite, it's hard to tell where to go with it, right? I think if you told most policymakers would probably agree the United States needs to lead in this area. We can't let the Chinese kind of take this technology space and be preeminent, which would argue for letting these companies do their thing, right? I mean, they're going to innovate, they're going to get big, they're going to develop. NVIDIA is worth more than the entire German stock market right now, right? So, I mean, most policymakers would stipulate that's an objective, but increasingly as we talk to them and their staffs, they'll also agree it seems implausible that these models can't disclose and be transparent about the data that they're taking in, right? This idea to me of data integrity and transparency, and as you said, DoD's got the leverage to go and say, if we're going to spend millions of dollars buying a product, we want to know how you trained it. HHS is going to likely do that. DOE is going to probably do that with education tools. They're not going to employ AI in American schools unless they know the data is truthful that went into it. So, I mean, I think to me those are two areas where, to the judge's point, you can start to kind of get policymakers a little bit focused and they can access that type of a solution set, and the EU's got that kind of baked into their model as well. So, I mean, that to me feels like some components that are emerging on the Hill where you do get a lot of heads nodding this idea of there needs to be some transparency. And you can't just say, oh, we got it from the Common Crawl.
I don't think it's hopeless. I wouldn't be here if I thought it was hopeless. I just think it's very difficult for a lot of the reasons I was outlining, but it's important to attack the problem and to do it jointly with allied countries and thinking democratic countries. I mean, one of the other blind spots of public policy makers in America today, in my opinion, is they think in very narrow domestic short time frame terms. What's going to get me elected next year? What's going to help the administration I'm a part of? What's going to get me more campaign contributions or more headlines, et cetera, et cetera? And they aren't thinking about how are we going to compete with China on anything, economics, military, intelligence, AI, you name it. They don't think so much in those terms except at the level that Chris Israel articulates that, well, we know we don't want China dominating everything, but that's only step one in the process. Then you have to figure out, well, how are you going to prevent that? And right now in the standard essential patent area, for example, China is making great strides by infiltrating all the bodies of engineers that set these standards. So the standards are increasingly reflecting Chinese interests and Chinese strategic needs They used to mostly reflect U.S. needs because we mostly used to dominate those bodies. But the Chinese are very crafty and very determined and very talented. I mean, you have to hand it to them. We talk about we're going to have domestic chip manufacturing. When China decides something is a priority, they don't put in 50 billion, they put in $1 trillion. And they get fabulous results out of that because that big an investment, if it's done half sensibly, is going to produce big stuff. So we have to enlarge our thinking geographically. That, you know, we're in a global world in terms of strategy and threats of war and threats of domination, and we're in a global world to a great extent, even just commercially. But our policymakers tend not to think globally, and they tend not to think about what about 5 or 10 years from now. They tend to think about the election next November 4th, period.
Right.
I have a point about the education part of this. The problem is that the Department of Education doesn't buy software for schools, period. Individual school districts select software for schools. They are not capable of determining what is going to be an accurate AI model and what isn't, and whether or not the software they've deployed into their schools is scraping students' data, whether they are or aren't. Google got sued in California after Google Classroom was rolled out, and they were, in fact, gathering a lot of data from the students who had been using Google Classroom in California. Google did have to change their actions afterwards. Software in classrooms has basically been a giant experiment for the last 10 or 15 years. But reflecting back up to your first point, I think what you're talking about is essentially a software bill of materials, an SBOM for AI. I am not sure it's possible to do that based on the way a lot of these models are trained, but we should be trying to develop essentially in the US an SBOM for AI so it can disclose as much as we know about the training, the model used, the information used to ground or tune the original model, and then the meta prompts that have been enabled for risk mitigation flow down. Currently, Microsoft's copyright commitment requires Microsoft Azure OpenAI users to enable that, essentially the copyright meta prompt. And so we need to be able testing the models and establishing what meta prompts are going to reduce risk for a lot of other applications.
Yeah, there's so much here, and one of the things I don't. Well, let me take a step back for just a second, because again, we talk, and I do the same thing. We talk about AI as if it is a thing. It exists. There are all kinds of different AI models, and the one that we seem to be most focusing on so far is the generative AI, and for a lot of reasons, right? That's captured people's imagination. There's all kinds of AI tools that are out there that are perfectly fine, perfectly legitimate. You know how it's coded, you know where it gets the information from, and it's very good at a discrete task, or maybe several discrete tasks, like in an industry, for doing X, Y, or Z. Then you have the generative AI, which is you're trying to train it and teach it, and that's where we're focusing on here now. And what worries me is you know, I hear from, we're going to have a copyright panel coming up, and people say, oh, well, you know, we've trained it, we can't take this stuff out that we've trained it on. We talked about that during the first panel a little bit. I think that's the least of our worries, I think what's going to happen with these generative AI tools is we're going to hit a point in time where they're all going to be thrown away. They have to be thrown away. You know, you can't train these AI tools on the garbage of the internet and expect it to be any smarter than the garbage of the internet. And if you're going to rely on it for defense or for one of these generative AI tools that had problems last week with all the things that we talked about, just announced that they're interfacing now, allowing people to interface with their finances. You know, it's like, what could possibly go wrong? You can't give me a picture of George Washington. You know, that it's actually George Washington. You know, you can't tell me that Adolf Hitler is worse than Elon Musk. And now you want us to integrate this with our finances? What could go wrong? I mean, it's craziness. But there are actors like the Department of Defense, like the schools, like et cetera, that are going to demand for their own reputational purposes. Like we had Jason show us the video of what he did for Coke. Coke is never gonna be associated with it. Just won't, right? With a tool that can't give you a correct picture of George Washington, that doesn't know that Adolf Hitler is bad, that et cetera, because of the reputational harm, and it overnight can be taken away. And Coke is a huge company, very protective of its image, like many companies. They're not unique, perhaps. But it strikes me that these tools are going to have to, you just throw it away and start over. Am I crazy? What do you guys think? I mean, do you see that coming, or is it just fanciful to think that that's going to happen?
Gene, even if you could convince everybody that everything has to be thrown away and start over with a stronger verification system, how are you going to make it happen? The default setting of the big companies that are mostly pioneering AI here is all regulation is bad. And therefore, I'm going to oppose anything that Congress is debating that's going to in any way limit my freedom of action, because I don't like regulation. I want to be able to do what I want to do. If I were at Google or another one of these big companies doing tons of astonishingly impressive AI work, I guess I wouldn't like regulation either. But I'm not the head of Google. Now I'm just a private citizen worried about the country. And so I'm not content to let any company just do whatever they decide they want to do, because the harms are too great and the opportunities to have better results are so promising. It's just crazy to ignore the system. But engineering progress is really tough in our current environment. Like everything else in the economic world, the political world also runs on money. So campaign contributions have enormous impact in Congress, state, federal, and local. It's all the same, basically. So if rich companies with endless money and endless arrays of lobby firms and law firms and PR firms are going to oppose any and all regulation, it's going to be really hard to get it implemented, no matter how worthwhile it might be in the conclusion of the populace at large, because the populace at large doesn't control what the political actors do. Other people do at a much more discrete level for very narrow self-interest reasons. And I think if we expect private actors to be patriotic and sacrifice money in order to do something that's socially more beneficial, yeah, a few will, but most of them probably won't.
No, I tend to agree with that. But by the same token, I also think that what's going to wind up happening, if we are crippled here in the U.S. by coming up with policies that make sense. Now, for God's sake, we can't even agree on Isaac Asimov's 3 rules of robots, right? Mm-hmm. We couldn't agree. The tech companies wouldn't agree to those kinds of things, right? What's going to happen is you're going to have Europe and others that are going to agree, that have a different history than we have and a different concern for privacy, for individual privacy than we do, are going to define it. And then you're going to have countries like China that are with the funding for startup companies and AI companies. You get more funding for those folks outside the U.S. than we do inside the U.S. The U.S. is abdicating its leadership role, which is a huge problem, because now not only are we going to lose jobs like Malik was talking about on the last panel, because AI is going to do other things, we're not going to have AI jobs, right? Because they're going to go to countries where, to China and Europe, where you can get funding for these programs, and people are growing, and our input is going to be marginalized. That's what I fear. That's what I see.
I'm not sure if that, you asked me whether or not I thought the EU would dominate. And the one thing I do know is that you didn't talking about the reputational value. And the prior panel talked about the reputational value. And circling back around to the question about education, OpenAI has partnered with Sal Khan of Khan Academy, and they have developed quite a good kind of math tutoring AI that cannot be bullied into letting you answer the wrong answer. And it was apparently trained on Sal Khan's videos and the material at Khan Academy. And if you want to talk about an empathetic, compassionate, high EQ, high IQ person to train on, that's a person I'd choose. Now, I haven't used the model myself. I don't know if how well it actually functions. But you are going to see those brand associations, like Microsoft deploying its own version, its own models of OpenAI into Azure, or with individuals who are lending their personal reputation to these ventures. And, you know, it's capitalism, so that might be the best we can do for now.
Yeah, I could see us going down the path of the equivalent of like an Energy Star rating, right? Like we have on our appliances. So 1 to 5 star rating on how trustworthy, how auditable, how explainable is this AI system, you know, and then the buyer decides. And if more people want the 4 and 5 star rated AI-enabled systems, those will be the ones that come out ahead, and that pushes the others to get to that point. I would also say that we focus a lot on the problems that different AI systems have. That's in part because AI that works, we don't think about it as AI anymore. It just becomes software. You know, we have to remember, artificial intelligence as a concept goes back decades, many, many decades. Longer than pretty much everyone in this room here. And so once it matures to a certain point, it becomes reliable to this extent that we don't even think about what an unreliable system of that particular usage is like. You know, it becomes an afterthought. TurboTax is AI. You can pick up your phone now, the image recognition works great, right? And so if you just do a keyword search in your photos, say if you have a lot of cat photos, you just type cat, all your cat pictures pop up. We don't even think twice about that. Autocomplete in our emails. We'll get there with large language models and generative AI. It's going to take time, but the example that you just gave, yes, absolutely it is possible to make these systems more robust and more reliable. The issue we're facing right now is that there's a big gold rush amongst a fairly small number of companies to release these models before they're ready for prime time. That's the biggest part of the problem right now, and it's generating a lot of attention because the mistakes are, at best very embarrassing, but they could be harmful. And what all these companies really need to do is hit the brakes and pause and really think through what it is that they're releasing out in the wild. Because once it's out in the open, you can't reel it back in, and you can't uninvent these models.
Gene, the bright side to me, and the reason I'm ultimately very optimistic, is that this country is endowed with extraordinarily talented people in every single realm. AI engineers, scientists of 1,000 different kinds, legal people, political people, economic people, strategy people, military people, on and on and on. We have an endless amount of talent in every category. So if we get ourselves organized to marshal this talent to address these problems, I'm confident they'll be well addressed. The immediate need is to marshal the talent that exists.
Yeah, amen. Well, we have about 1 minute left. So what I'd like to do, though, is give each of you an opportunity to wrap up lightning round fashion. What do you want folks to leave today remembering? Jen, let's start with you. If they remember only one thing, what do you hope that it is?
The HIPAA and High-Tech Act is where the U.S. excels at data privacy. The High-Tech Act required all physicians to standardize how they record their interactions with you. And that law allows anonymized data sets to be exported fairly easily for use. I think the US will lead, especially in AI related to healthcare.
Great, thanks, Jen. Martin, let's go to you and give Judge the final word.
Okay. Well, I really liked what the judge just said about the amazing talent and capability that the U.S. has. So I believe it was Winston Churchill who said it. You can count on the U.S. to do the right thing after it's exhausted all other options. So I think that's the road we're going down. But light at the end of the tunnel.
Great, thanks a lot, Martin. And Judge, final word to you.
Well, we think instinctively that the primary function of lawyers, beside advising clients, is to educate, inform, and persuade judges. But I want to suggest that lawyers and those who work with them have an equally important function and duty to educate policymakers, not only judges, but members of Congress, people in the executive branch, people in the departments, and if the talent that exists in the legal community gets engaged in teaching, the policymakers will get it right soon enough.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.